I'm taking you to an unexpected spot of the gallery today. We're in the entrance hall where, if you look down, you'll find a striking, often overlooked piece of 20th century art, featuring a pub sign, a football game, and a Christmas pudding. But since we typically only collect historic paintings, it may come as a surprise that these thoroughly modern mosaics are part of the building. These mosaics by Boris Anrep were created for the gallery between 1928 and 1952. For the millions of people visiting the National Gallery every year, Anrep's mosaics have been some of the first artworks they've encountered, perhaps without even realizing it. So, how did these very modern mosaics come to be installed here at the National Gallery? And what famous figures might you spot in them next time you visit us? Let's take a look at each of the works. There are 4 mosaics adorning the hall's floors, which draw from antiquity yet celebrate aspects of modern life. Anrep, a known philanderer who was born in St. Petersburg, Russia, and moved in elite cultural circles across London and Paris, offered a romantically utopian or idealized vision of everyday living in his first 2 mosaics, The Labours of Life and The Pleasures of Life. These panels show us Anrep's distinctively modernist vision of human progress across the arts and sciences. In these early mosaics, we see Anrep invent his own iconography for modern life with a medley of contemporary cultural references and its own illustrative composition. The third mosaic, The Awakening of the Muses, was made in 1933 and features the ancient Greek gods Bacchus and Apollo in a symbolic representation of artistic insight. Anrep based the designs for these mythological figures on individuals from his intellectual and artistic sphere, capturing their likenesses from memory and photographs. The modernist writer Virginia Woolf appears as Cleo, the muse of history, the Hollywood actor Greta Garbo as Melpomene, the muse of tragedy, and the art critic Clive Bell as Bacchus, the god of wine and festivity. In the final mosaic, The Modern Virtues, completed 19 years later in 1952, we see a shift in register. Fantastical imagery and contemporary figures like T.S. Eliot jostle alongside references to the trauma of the Second World War. The most ambitious work of the entire scheme, this mosaic exhibits a newfound visual density in Anrep's work, with increasingly complex perspectives and illusions of depth. The themes and motifs of the mosaics, such as artistic activity, classical mythology, and visual allegories, are not unfamiliar here at the National Gallery. But since we typically only collect historic paintings, it may come as a surprise that these thoroughly modern mosaics, which were commissioned as contemporary site-specific artworks, are part of the building. It was Anrep himself who first proposed the idea of making a mosaic on the entrance hall floor after being inspired by the pavement artists working outside on Trafalgar Square. Our trustees were supportive, suggesting that Anrep should produce, and I quote, a design on classical and more or less conventional lines. Instead, Anrep submitted his elaborate and decidedly unconventional outlines for the labours and pleasures, which the trustees ultimately approved. Perhaps more surprising is just how laborious the physical process was to get the mosaic set down on this floor. Unlike many contemporary mosaic designers, who often outsource the work of laying the tesserae, the small tiles that make up a mosaic, to commercial companies, Anrep was a keen craftsman. For these mosaics, he made paper versions of his designs and glued the tesserae to them in his Paris studio before transporting them in fragments to London. The assembled tesserae were then laid into the gallery's floor, the paper was washed off with water to expose the marble beneath, and the work was finally treated with 4 days' worth of polishing. This meticulous method, known as the transfer or indirect method, was quite different to our more usual work of researching, interpreting, and hanging historic paintings. It shows the gallery's willingness to work with contemporary artists in its spaces, even in such a rigorous and permanent way. This tradition of inviting artists to curate or make new work at the gallery was revived in the 1980s and 1990s and continues to this day with our current programme of commissions and artist residencies. Anrep was making these new works specifically for the gallery, but his influences tended to come from outside of our collection, particularly from the Byzantine mosaics of late antiquity, which focus primarily on sacred subjects. In 1927, Anrep wrote about the impressionistic and spiritual dimensions of mosaic from the 4th to 6th centuries, and adapted the flat perspectives and stylized angles found within Byzantine works for his own designs. We can see this in the frontal, formalized composition of the panel Open Mind. Here, the largely symmetrical organization and its flattened pictorial plane suggests something closer to the Byzantine tradition, with the gravity of the judge's expression and pose recalling that of a religious icon. In particular, Anrep rejected the impulse of Renaissance mosaic designers, who he believed attempted to imitate painting, as he passionately believed in mosaic as its own formal discipline with its own unique material qualities. Modernism was a period that sought modes of expression beyond realism, and in effect drew attention to the tools of its own representation, and Anrep's mosaics are a fascinating example of this. But Anrep didn't only look to the past, he also looked to his contemporaries. As a member of the Bloomsbury Set, a loose group of avant-garde artists and intellectuals working in London, including Virginia Woolf and Clive Bell, who appeared in The Awakening, Anrep was exposed to post-impressionist and modernist aesthetics. The influential art critic Roger Fry, who was central to the Bloomsbury group, invited Anrep to curate the Russian section of his second post-impressionist exhibition in 1912, and later identified a correlation between mosaic and the pictorial experiments of painters such as Gauguin and Matisse. We can see this connection, for instance, in Anrep's panel Speed from the Pleasures mosaic. Here, it is clear how the individual units of the tessera work together to form a schematic whole, such that the mosaic's method of production is patently on display. And while the woman is rendered in a semi-realist, semi-abstracted style, the rusty orange that neatly brings together the scarf, bike, and tree suggests a decorative use of colouring. We might therefore say that the Anrep mosaics embody the old and the new in multiple different ways: a medium from antiquity and a modern theme, a 100-year-old space and a newly commissioned artwork, and a style that brings together both the 4th and 20th centuries. Today, the mosaics lie between some of the earliest and latest parts of our collection, providing a singular moment of direct physical contact with an artwork before visitors re-enter the galleries. They bookend the gallery's history of European art, along with Bridget Riley's abstract wall painting, Messengers from 2019, another work commissioned by the gallery, which you can see when standing on the vestibules. Both works were specifically designed for the spaces, and both are key to the gallery's ongoing engagement with contemporary art and artists. And as one of a small number of 20th century works on display, the mosaics remain a captivating snapshot of an era of historical tumult and formal innovation. If you're interested in learning more about the collection, you can click here or here. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.